Behind the doors of a perfect home, where everything looked flawless to the world, there was a secret no one could imagine. A silence heavier than words, a love tested by pride, and a choice that would change everything. This is not just a story about sickness or marriage, it's about what happens when appearances matter more than the truth. And in the shadows of shame, life itself prepares a lesson so powerful, it cannot be ignored. Stay until the end, because what you are about to hear may change the way you see love, pride, and the fragile line between losing and truly living. If stories like this make you reflect on life, love, and the choices that truly matter, subscribe now. And share in the comments, what did this story make you feel? The street looked like a movie set. Bright facades, well-kept gardens, balconies draped with bougainvillea spilling color over the walls. From behind the gates came the smell of coffee and warm bread, and neighbors greeted each other with smiles that required no intimacy. It was there that Andrew and Helen built their dream home: tall windows, linen curtains. From the outside, a showcase. From the inside, the sound of doors closing softly. Andrew came home with his tie perfectly tightened, leather briefcase in hand, and his brisk steps echoing authority. He greeted the doorman, waved at neighbors, made quick remarks about the weather and the market. His smile seemed capable of opening doors and contracts. Helen, when he entered, always had a vase of flowers from the garden on the table and a warm soup waiting. The kitchen clock ticked at the same rhythm every day. The illness arrived as small things often do: a stumble, a faint spell, a weakness that wouldn't go away with orange juice. Helen laughed at herself, said it was nothing but fatigue, but soon her eyes sought chairs before her legs admitted it. In the doctor's office, the words came carefully: a long treatment, daily medication, periods of rest, patience. She nodded. Andrew asked how long it would take to get back to normal, while his mind calculated meetings and deadlines. In the first days, the house tried to pretend nothing had changed. Helen carried cups with one hand while leaning on the counter with the other, pacing her steps so she wouldn't draw attention. When her body demanded a pause, she invented excuses to sit down. "I'll check the garden." On the sofa, she learned to breathe slowly, counting the beats of the clock. Andrew crossed the living room on diagonals, speaking in short phrases. "Did you take your medicine? Do you need something? I'll be late." His care came wrapped in hurry. Neighbors asked about Helen in chat groups, and Andrew replied with smiling emojis, always in control. He started going alone to business lunches. "She prefers to rest," he said without asking her. At his niece's birthday, he bought the gift, took pictures, told stories about goals and growth, but didn't mention the empty chair by the window. Helen noticed every gesture with the delicacy of someone who collects fallen leaves in a notebook. His hand letting go of hers too early on the street, the "we'll see later" excuse, the evasive glance when someone asked about her health. There were no shouts. There was absence. And absence weighs heavily when it pretends not to exist. One Friday, she wore a simple blue dress, pinned her hair with an old clip, and waited in the hallway. "The doctor said I could try a short concert," she said, her hope shining timidly. Andrew adjusted his watch, checked his phone. "Not tonight. I've got an early meeting." The calendar, however, showed Saturday. She gave a small smile, put her purse away, turned off the light, and walked slowly to the kitchen. Steam rose from the kettle, veiling her face. On a saucer, 2 plain crackers. On the radio, an old song played about promises kept. Helen listened until the end and whispered to herself before sipping her tea, "It will pass." Across the street, Mrs. Esther, a widow with short steps, watched the lit house as if reading a book from afar. She noticed the shadow moving behind the curtains and memorized the hour when the living room went dark. When Helen carried her teacup away, Mrs. Esther closed her own curtain. The neighborhood resumed its perfect silence. Inside the flawless house, however, the night opened a small crack through which, slowly, the wind would start to enter. The next day, Andrew received invitations to a company cocktail. He passed them along without mentioning Helen, justifying it with, "Better for you to rest." The phrase lingered in the house. Later that week, more events appeared, and with them the habit of hiding grew stronger. Excuses repeated themselves like mantras. For every absence of Helen, Andrew had a polished, convincing explanation ready. At a business lunch, he told colleagues that his wife doesn't enjoy formal environments. At his nephew's school meeting, he said she was handling some personal matters. At a friend's dinner, the phrase was simply, "Helen prefers staying home." Everyone accepted his answers because words spoken with confidence tend to silence questions. Helen noticed her husband's efforts to keep her away from any kind of social stage. She never confronted him. She watched him adjust his tie in front of the mirror, practicing the smile that brought him contracts. She listened to him rehearse quick jokes and revise lines meant to impress. While Andrew prepared for the world, she prepared for another night alone. She chose a book, warmed her usual tea, arranged the pillows. The house always seemed too large when his steps disappeared through the gate. What hurt most wasn't his absence, but the way he looked at her when they were together. A glance that was brief, sidelong, almost like someone avoiding a mirror they dislike. Walking down the street, he always quickened his pace, leaving her behind, breathless. When she tried to reach for his hand, he would pull away to check his phone, pretending he had an urgent call. Helen stored those denied gestures in her heart the way one collects invisible scars. One afternoon, as they returned from the hospital, they ran into cheerful neighbors carrying shopping bags. Helen smiled faintly and greeted them, but Andrew hurried to cut the moment short. "She's tired, let's go in quickly," he said, fumbling for the key and closing the gate before the exchange could continue. Once inside, Helen asked softly, "Are you ashamed of me?" He hesitated before answering. "Of course not. I'm just being careful." But his tone betrayed him. Days turned into a routine of justifications. Andrew came home later and later, claiming long hours at work. Helen suspected many of those hours were spent at dinners and gatherings where she was never welcome. Sometimes she found wrinkled invitations in his pockets, flyers for new restaurants, or tickets from the theater. He brushed them off as things from colleagues, but his silence said otherwise. Still, Helen didn't accuse him. Her nature was patient, her faith sustained her. She believed that enduring in silence was its own form of strength. Yet inside, sadness carved deeper and deeper space. In her nightstand, she kept notebooks where she poured her feelings. Memories of joyful days, descriptions of the small humiliations, whispered prayers for courage. Words became the safe place where she could exist, even if Andrew no longer truly saw her. One Sunday evening, Helen gathered courage and asked, "Could we have dinner out, just the two of us? It's been so long since we've gone anywhere together." Andrew pretended to check his phone, then replied, "This week is impossible, darling. I'll make it up to you later." He closed the phone, changed the subject, and stood up. Helen smiled faintly, already knowing the answer. She cleared the plates, washed the dishes, turned off the light. Dinner out was postponed to later, and later never came. The neighborhood began to notice. Women from the church prayer group asked about Helen and received vague answers. One remarked, "Strange, she used to be so present and now she's never around." Andrew pretended not to hear. But Helen heard. Words like that echoed louder because they confirmed what she already knew: she was being erased. Between the silent living room and the cold bedroom, Helen closed her eyes and tried to summon old memories. Their wedding day, Andrew's smile when she walked down the aisle, the promise they made to be together in sickness and in health. The cruel irony struck her. Now in sickness, he was further away than ever. That night, before falling asleep, Helen prayed a short prayer. Not for healing but for the courage to remain seen, even if only by God. Meanwhile, Andrew turned to the other side of the bed, his mind consumed only by tomorrow's meeting. Each week brought a new episode that, on its own, might have gone unnoticed, but together they painted a mosaic of quiet humiliations. Andrew's contempt was never loud. There were no insults or shouting. Instead, there were small gestures, silences carefully measured, each one carving away a piece of Helen's dignity. At a family lunch, for example, when someone suggested a group photo, Andrew quickly positioned himself next to nephews and siblings. Helen, still struggling to stand, lagged behind. By the time she reached the group, the camera had already clicked. She forced a smile to hide the sting, but her absence in the photograph was a cruel reminder of her absence in his life. On another occasion, Helen spent the entire afternoon preparing a special dinner. Even weak, she carefully chose simple recipes, decorated the table with flowers from the garden, and lit candles. She hoped to surprise Andrew with a gesture of love. But when he arrived home, he carried with him the smell of expensive food. "I had dinner with the team, an important business meeting," he said, without noticing the table waiting for him. Helen quietly blew out the candles and placed the food in the refrigerator. Over time, their conversations dwindled into nothing but practical exchanges. "Did you take your medicine?" replaced, "How are you feeling?" "Did you sign the check for the electric bill?" stood where, "Did you sleep well?" used to be. Words that should have carried care became mere tasks on a checklist. Helen answered gently as always, but inside she longed for the intimacy that was slipping further away with each passing day. When she finally managed to attend Sunday Mass after weeks of absence, Helen walked slowly to the front pew. She was met with surprised looks. Some women greeted her warmly, others whispered about how long she had been gone. Andrew, standing beside her, kept his face neutral. He held her hand only until they entered the church. As soon as others noticed, he let go, pretending to scratch his face. Helen felt the chill in her fingers more than the breeze that drifted through the stained glass. Humiliations also came in words, veiled as explanations. When asked about her, Andrew would respond with phrases like, "She's not feeling well," "She's too fragile to come along," or, "It's complicated for her right now." He made her sound like a burden, an embarrassment to be hidden. No one confronted him directly, but some looks of disapproval lingered. Helen noticed those looks and, in her heart, felt grateful. At least there were still people who saw her as more than her illness. One night, while folding Andrew's clothes, she found a crumpled invitation in the pocket of his jacket. It was for the grand opening of a new restaurant. He had gone, of course, without mentioning it. She opened the envelope and saw the guest list, where couples were invited together. Her name wasn't there. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she stared at the paper, tears threatening but never falling. She had learned to swallow her sorrow so it wouldn't disturb him. Later, in her notebook, she wrote, "To be alive and invisible hurts more than dying." Day by day, Helen faded into the background of her own home. Her routine was reduced to waiting for the sound of the gate, listening to his hurried footsteps, pretending to be fine so as not to cause inconvenience. Still, she nurtured small gestures, leaving him a note on the table, preparing a dessert when she had strength, whispering a prayer as she watched him sleep. Her hope, wounded but not dead, clung to silence. Andrew, however, remained blind to the abyss growing between them. He believed he was managing the situation, protecting his image. He didn't see that, in distancing himself from his wife, he was also cutting himself off from the only person who would have loved him without applause. And in that landscape of quiet pain, it was an outside gaze, attentive, unexpected, that would soon begin to see what Andrew refused to face. On that street of perfect facades, there was one window that never stopped observing. It belonged to Mrs. Esther, a 90-year-old widow, her white hair tied neatly in a bun, her posture small but her gaze sharp with decades of experience. Every afternoon she sat in her armchair near the window, a book resting on her lap and a shawl around her shoulders. The reading was often just a pretext. Her eyes searched for the hidden stories unfolding in the lives of her neighbors. It was through that window that she began to notice Helen. She saw her watering the plants while seated, holding the watering can with difficulty yet still smiling at the flowers. She saw her place a teacup on the windowsill and sit silently, staring at the sky as though searching for answers among the clouds. Mrs. Esther, who had already buried a husband and 2 children, recognized in Helen's silence something deeper than fatigue, loneliness disguised as composure. In contrast, she also observed Andrew. He rushed through the gate, phone pressed to his ear, his steps loud and hurried. In the mornings he barely kissed his wife. At night, he came back more drained than willing to look at what was inside his own home. One afternoon, as Helen sat on the porch steps, struggling to catch her breath after climbing just a few stairs, Mrs. Esther could no longer remain still. She filled a bowl with hot soup, crossed the street with her short steps and offered it with a smile. "Here, dear. Soup heals what medicine takes too long to reach." Helen was surprised by the kindness. Her eyes lit up as she accepted it, not just grateful for the food but for the gesture itself, for being seen. "Thank you so much, Mrs. Esther. It's been a while since I've tasted something made with so much care." At that very moment Andrew arrived. He saw his fragile wife sitting with soup in her lap and the elderly neighbor beside her. Instead of gratitude, his first reaction was discomfort, as if Helen's weakness exposed him. "That wasn't necessary," he said curtly, hoping to cut the moment short. But Mrs. Esther, not easily intimidated, met his gaze and replied with the calm authority of someone who had lived long enough to know the truth. "Sometimes, the things we think are unnecessary are exactly the things that save us." Her words fell heavy in the air. Andrew forced a polite smile, muttered thanks, and led Helen inside. Yet the phrase clung to him like a splinter. In the days that followed, Mrs. Esther continued her small gestures. She brought flowers from her yard, asked gently about Helen's medication, shared old stories to lift her spirits. Each visit seemed to brighten Helen a little, reminding her that she still mattered. Andrew, however, felt only unease. To him, the neighbor's presence was a mirror reflecting his failures. He began to dismiss her with remarks like, "That old lady meddles too much." Helen, on the other hand, defended her softly, "She's only trying to help. And she does help." The contrast between them grew sharper. While Andrew obsessed over appearances and reputation, Esther looked directly at essence and need. While he ran from weakness, she embraced fragility as part of life. On a rainy night, when the power went out briefly, Helen lit candles and reheated the soup Esther had brought. They sat together at the table, but the silence between them was thick. Helen looked at Andrew and asked, not accusing, only searching, "Are you ashamed of me?" He looked away, stirring his spoon without answering. Inside he knew the truth, but he couldn't yet say it aloud. As the candle flickered, Helen realized that his silence was already an answer. And across the street, in her dimly lit window, Mrs. Esther watched quietly, knowing this story still had much to teach. The following weeks brought Andrew a stream of invitations and praise. At work, he was celebrated as a model of leadership, a man of vision and discipline. He received awards, spoke at conferences, and posed for glossy business magazines. To the company, he was a polished symbol of success. To society, a story worth admiring. The most important night arrived in the form of a grand corporate gala. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, tables covered in linen, and glasses sparkling under the light. Executives, clients, and journalists filled the room. Andrew stood at the center in a dark tailored suit, a measured smile on his face, a glass of wine in his hand. He was introduced as the man who turns challenges into opportunities. Helen stayed home. She prepared for her solitude with ritual precision. A warm cup of tea, a shawl around her shoulders, and the silence that had become her constant companion. Before leaving, Andrew had said simply, "It's better if you rest. This event will be long and tiring." It wasn't a suggestion, it was a verdict. Helen smiled faintly, not daring to argue, and watched him walk out the door. On the stage at the gala, Andrew accepted an award for inspirational leadership. Applause thundered through the hall as he launched into a speech full of sharp lines and clever metaphors. He spoke of discipline, vision, relentless effort. The crowd hung on every word. Then, at the end, a reporter approached with a microphone. "Mr. Andrews, who inspires you most at home?" The question cut through the applause like an arrow. For a split second, Helen flashed in his mind, sitting on the couch, her pale hands wrapped around a teacup, her quiet endurance. His throat tightened. But then pride overpowered honesty. "My team is my family," he replied smoothly. The crowd cheered again. But inside, an emptiness echoed. At that same moment, Helen sat alone in the living room, flipping through an old photo album. She paused on a picture of their wedding day, Andrew smiling wide as she walked down the aisle, promising to stand beside her, in sickness and in health. Her fingers traced the edges of the photo. Tears gathered, not in rage but in quiet grief. Back at the gala, a colleague patted Andrew on the shoulder and joked, "Your wife must be proud of you." Andrew forced a laugh and deflected. "She doesn't care much for this kind of thing." Another erasure. When he returned home after midnight, his suit carried the faint sense of perfume and wine, remnants of congratulatory hugs and social chatter. Helen was asleep on the sofa, the album still open across her lap. Andrew closed it quietly and covered her with a blanket. For a fleeting second, guilt tugged at him. He stood there staring at her fragile frame in the dim light, but instead of confessing his shame, he turned away. The following days, the company's social media shared photos of the gala. Andrew reposted them proudly, collecting dozens of congratulatory comments. Helen, scrolling on her phone, saw the pictures too. Not once was she mentioned in his captions. Not a single word of thanks. She existed only in the shadows. In the neighborhood, people murmured, "We're lucky to live near such a successful man." Only Mrs. Esther remained silent, her sharp eyes catching what others missed, that a showcase can be polished, yet hollow behind the glass. One rainy afternoon, Helen asked softly, "Do you still feel proud of me?" Andrew answered too quickly, "Of course I do, why wouldn't I?" But he couldn't hold her gaze. That night, in the bedroom, the golden award stood on the nightstand, its shine reflecting the dim light. Andrew lay awake, staring at it, realizing how heavy silence could be. The trophy gleamed, but the distance between him and his wife was brighter still. For the first time in months, sleep did not come easily. Sunday dawned gray with thin rain streaking the windows. Helen remained curled on the sofa, wrapped in a blanket, trying to warm not just her body but her weary soul. Andrew paced the house with restless steps, pretending to be busy. He shuffled through papers, tapped on his phone, opened drawers without purpose. In truth, he was trying to escape the heavy silence that had followed him since the gala. On the coffee table lay a stack of simple notebooks. They were Helen's journals, filled with class notes, sketches, and personal reflections. Out of curiosity, or perhaps out of a need he could not name, Andrew opened one. Between pages of delicate handwriting and small flower doodles, he found a folded sheet of paper. It was unfinished, written in blue ink, some words smudged as if touched by tears. He read slowly. Andrew, I don't want to be a burden in your life. I know my good days have become rare, but I am still the same woman who once chose to walk beside you. I am not only an illness, I am the memory of laughter, of bus rides, of mornings when coffee tasted like a promise. Sometimes I feel I no longer belong in your world. As if I were invisible, as if my presence disrupted your plans. Perhaps I'm mistaken. Perhaps it's only fear. But when you leave me behind, when you let go of my hand, I feel like I am disappearing. I don't ask for luxury or spectacle. I ask only for your hand. A hand to hold, a hand that falters with mine, a hand unashamed of me. If one day I'm gone, remember who I was before this sickness. The woman who loved, who taught children to draw courage, who turned our kitchen into a place of hope. I don't want shame to be the inheritance left between us. H. The words cut like invisible blades. They did not shout, yet each line pierced deeply. Andrew closed his eyes, drawing in a breath that felt too heavy. For a moment he thought of waking her, of saying something, anything, that might build a bridge. But cowardice held him still. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into the notebook as though hiding it could erase its truth. In the bathroom, he let cold water run over his face, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The man in the glass looked polished, but his eyes revealed fatigue that success could not conceal. The letter echoed in his head, I don't want shame to be the inheritance. Shame. The very word he had tried so hard to avoid now shouted inside him. That night, Helen noticed the notebooks had been moved. She suspected he had read them but chose not to ask. Instead, she did what she always did, she offered silence. Silence that protected him but also widened the distance between them. The following days were strange. Andrew grew quieter, carrying himself with a weight that no one else could see. At work, he forgot details, missed deadlines, snapped at colleagues. At home, he watched Helen from a distance, his throat tightening whenever he thought of speaking the truth. One evening, Helen said softly, almost as if reassuring him, I write because it's the only way to organize what I feel. Sometimes, it's the only way I don't lose myself. Andrew nodded, unable to admit that he had already read her most vulnerable thoughts. Her words were knives because they were true. Each line of that letter exposed not only her pain but his failure. For the first time, Andrew saw not just the sickness of his wife but the mirror of his own coldness. Pride, once a fortress, had begun to crack. And through those cracks, life was preparing to shine a light he could no longer ignore. On a humid Monday morning, Andrew left the house earlier than usual. Helen, still half asleep, heard the gate close and the sound of his car fading down the street. She clutched the blanket closer to her chest, as if it could shield her from his absence. Outside, Andrew carried not only files and graphs but also the burden of the letter he had read days before. The elevator at the office stopped between 2 floors, trapping him for 15 agonizing minutes. By the time he entered the conference room, sweat dampened the collar of his pressed shirt. Inside, tense faces awaited him. Their largest client had delivered sharp criticism of the project Andrew was leading. Missed deadlines, poor communication, a lack of real leadership. Andrew tried to defend himself, but his voice, once confident and commanding, sounded shaky. He attempted to place the blame on his team, but no one came to his aid. The director summed it up coldly. Leadership isn't about standing in the spotlight, Andrew. Leadership is care. You distanced yourself from the team and the team distanced itself from you. The words echoed like a hammer strike. Leadership is care. It wasn't only a critique of his work, it was a sentence over his life. On the ride home, he stared at his reflection in the car window. For the first time, he saw the emptiness behind the polished smile he wore so easily. The image staring back was of a man celebrated in public, yet hollow and failing where it mattered most. When he arrived, Helen was in the yard with Mrs. Esther. They were laughing softly, sharing stories in low voices. The gentle sound of his wife's laughter cut Andrew more deeply than any boardroom insult. Even ill, Helen still managed to find joy in small things. And he, healthy, successful, applauded, couldn't find joy in himself. Helen coughed suddenly, clutching her chest. Andrew instinctively took a step forward, but stopped halfway, uncertain of what to do with his hands. Mrs. Esther moved without hesitation, holding Helen's arm with steady kindness. Strength, my dear. A cough won't topple someone with such deep roots. Helen smiled in gratitude. Andrew, watching from the doorway, felt like a stranger in his own home. That night, he sat alone in the darkened living room. On the shelf beside him stood his gleaming corporate award. He picked it up, staring at the distorted reflection of his face in the golden surface. In the ballroom it had seemed grand. Here it looked small and absurd. His mind drifted back to their wedding, to Helen walking down the aisle in her simple dress, to the moment he promised to be there, in sickness and in health. Now sickness had come and he had fled. The words returned to him like a debt he had never paid. He went to bed late but couldn't sleep. Helen lay beside him, her face lit softly by the bedside lamp. He studied her delicate features, the marks left by time and illness. For a fleeting moment, tenderness rose in him. He almost reached out to brush her cheek. But pride, that heavy chain, pulled his hand back. He turned away, closing his eyes against the weight of his own weakness. The fall of pride does not come in a single crash. It happens in cracks, small and relentless, until the structure can no longer hold. Andrew didn't admit it out loud, not yet. But deep inside he felt the first fissures breaking open. His polished world was starting to collapse. And life was only preparing the next scene, one where there would be nowhere left for him to hide. The day seemed ordinary, but life often chooses the most unexpected moments to turn the page. It was a Saturday morning, sunlight filtering through the neighborhood trees, when Helen asked to accompany Andrew to the market. It had been too long since she'd gone out, and she longed for fresh air, to see people, to taste the simple pleasure of walking beyond the walls of their home. Andrew hesitated. His first instinct was to refuse, but guilt, or perhaps fear of her silence, made him agree. As they walked, Helen leaned gently on his arm, though Andrew kept a careful distance, worried about appearances. He pretended to answer a phone call, slipping his arm away, leaving her a few steps behind, pale and short of breath. Inside the crowded market, between shelves stacked high and voices buzzing, Helen suddenly felt dizzy. She gripped the cart to steady herself, but her legs gave out. She collapsed to her knees, her purse spilling open, scattering medicine bottles across the floor. The noise drew immediate attention. A woman rushed forward to help her, a young man gathered the pills, and soon a circle formed around Helen. Andrew froze. For a few seconds he didn't move. His first reaction wasn't concern, but shame. Dozens of eyes turned toward them, and the weight of their stares pressed harder than his wife's trembling body. "Should we call an ambulance?" someone asked. "Is she all right?" another insisted. Helen forced a faint smile, though her face was pale, and whispered, "I just need some air, it will pass." Only then did Andrew kneel beside her, movements awkward, more concerned with saving face than with holding her steady. A neighbor recognized them and spoke aloud, her voice filled with pity. "Such a shame to see such a kind woman suffer like this." The words pierced Andrew like a blade. Not because of the sympathy for Helen, but because they exposed him. He, the man who always stood immaculate before the world, was now revealed as a husband absent where it mattered most. They moved Helen to a bench near the entrance. A woman fanned her with a bag, another offered water. Strangers showed more care than Andrew had in months. Helen, still weak, thanked them with her characteristic gentleness, apologizing for the commotion. The contrast was unbearable. Others saw her value, while her own husband had only seen her as a burden. On the way home, the silence in the car was different. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of two people tired, nor the cold silence of recent months. It was the silence of truth exposed. Andrew's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his chest heavy with words he couldn't release. "I'm sorry. I failed you. I don't want to hide anymore." But none of them crossed his lips. Helen, gazing out the window, looked fragile but also strangely stronger. She knew she had been seen, not by Andrew but by others. And that recognition gave her a kind of comfort. Even if invisible at home, she still existed in the eyes of the world. When they arrived, Mrs. Esther was already waiting at the gate, as though she had sensed everything. She embraced Helen firmly and guided her inside, preparing tea with calm hands. Andrew stood nearby, awkward, watching as the elderly woman did with ease what he had refused to do, offer simple care. That night, alone in the living room, Andrew recalled the letter once again. "I don't want shame to be the inheritance left between us." Finally he understood. The greatest shame had never been Helen's illness, it was his own cowardice. The turning point had come, not in a dramatic lightning strike, but in the quiet accumulation of moments that stripped away his excuses. Life, generous and merciless at once, had left him with no more places to hide. And for the first time he began to sense that if he did not change soon, the price of his indifference could become irreversible. The scene at the market had only been the first crack. In the days that followed, Helen's health worsened. Her coughing fits became more frequent, her weakness more visible. Andrew watched her from a distance, torn between guilt and pride. It was as though he feared coming too close and at the same time, feared losing her completely. One silent night, he heard her crying softly in the bedroom. She pressed her face into the pillow to muffle the sound, but each sob struck Andrew like a hammer. He lay still, pretending to sleep, too cowardly to turn and hold her. He pulled the blanket over his head, letting the silence do the talking. At work, his image began to crack further. Colleagues avoided his meetings, clients questioned his decisions, and the directors eyed him with growing suspicion. Andrew remembered the harsh words in the boardroom, "Leadership is care." They weren't just a professional critique, they were a verdict over his entire life. At home, Helen poured more and more of herself into her notebooks. She filled the pages with memories of happier days, honeymoon travels, simple afternoons with coffee on the porch, laughter on rainy days. But she also wrote down the pain, his absence, the looks he avoided, the broken promises. Those notebooks became a place where her voice still existed, even if Andrew refused to listen. One evening, Andrew found the stack of notebooks again. He didn't open them this time. He simply held them in his hands, feeling their weight, not of paper but of years. They contained the silent record of all the moments he had erased. Later that night, he looked at Helen as she slept. He remembered their wedding day, her radiant smile as she walked down the aisle, his own voice promising to stand by her, in sickness and in health. He remembered the early years, when she believed in him even as bills piled up and dreams felt far away. She had never been ashamed of him, not even when he had little to offer. On the contrary, she always spoke of him with pride. Now, cruelly reversed, he was the one ashamed of her. The realization hit him like a stone. The price of his indifference was becoming clear. Helen began to refuse invitations even from Mrs. Esther. She said she was too tired. Her voice grew weaker, her eyes dimmer. Andrew feared that her light would fade entirely before he found the courage to change. One morning as he left for work, he found Mrs. Esther waiting at the gate. Her back was slightly bent, but her voice was steady. "What kills faster than illness, son, is loneliness. Haven't you learned that yet?" Andrew said nothing. He got into his car and drove off, but her words followed him like an open wound. All day he was distracted, forgetting numbers, missing appointments. For the first time, he realized he could no longer separate his personal failure from his professional one. The weight was everywhere. That evening, he returned to find Helen sitting in an armchair, staring blankly into space. There were no tears, no anger, just a heavy weariness in her eyes. It hurt more than any accusation. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Finally, he placed his hand gently on her arm, a small, almost timid gesture. Helen turned her head, surprised. She didn't say anything. But in that silence, Andrew realized something. There was still time, fragile, fleeting, but time nonetheless. The price of indifference was steep and he had already paid much. But if he didn't change, he would pay with the one thing he could never replace. For the first time, the fear of losing her outweighed the fear of what others might think. And in that fragile balance between regret and hope, life was preparing the final lesson. The next morning, the house felt quieter than ever. Helen took longer than usual to rise. Sunlight had already stretched through the curtains when Andrew entered the bedroom and found her sitting on the edge of the bed, her eyes lowered, her breath shallow. For a moment, panic seized him. Was he too late? He stepped closer and for the first time in so long, he held her hand without caring who might see. Helen looked up, startled. Her eyes, though tired, still carried a softness capable of breaking down any wall. "You seem different today," she whispered, offering a fragile smile. Andrew swallowed hard. He wanted to say everything at once, but the words tangled in his chest. He sat beside her and began with what weighed most heavily. "Forgive me, Helen. I've spent too much time worrying about what others think. I forgot to look at the one person who has always been by my side." She studied him in silence. For once, Andrew did not turn away. He let her see the vulnerability he had hidden from the world. "I was ashamed of you," he confessed, voice breaking. "But the truth is, the greater shame was mine. I failed you as a husband. I failed as a man." Helen rested her head gently on his shoulder. "I always knew pride blinded you," she murmured softly. "But I also believed that one day life would show you what really matters." Her words carried no anger, only the calm of someone who had forgiven long before hearing the apology. That simple grace shattered the last remnants of Andrew's armor. In the days that followed, he began to change in small but decisive ways. He went with her to doctor's appointments, held her hand in public without hesitation, prepared tea during her long nights of coughing. At the market, once the scene of his shame, he walked proudly beside her, introducing her without flinching. "This is my wife, Helen. The strongest woman I know." Helen smiled, not because she craved recognition, but because she finally felt the weight she carried was being shared. One afternoon, as the sun set behind the rooftops, Mrs. Esther crossed the street with her slow, careful steps, a satisfied smile on her face. She placed a homemade cake on the table and said, "I told you life teaches. Some learn through love, others through pain. But everyone learns eventually." Andrew thanked her sincerely and Helen laughed quietly. The air in the house felt different now. Where once there had been heavy silence, there was conversation, shared glances, and real presence. Helen's body remained fragile. The illness had not vanished. But her spirit was lighter, upheld by something no medicine could prescribe: rediscovered love. At church, when she returned by Andrew's side, she was welcomed with warm embraces. Andrew, no longer ashamed, stood tall next to her. Some parishioners praised him and he didn't deflect or pretend. He simply said, "I've learned there's no shame in love. The only shame is refusing to love when you still can." The lesson of life was clear. Trophies, appearances, and speeches could never define a man. What mattered was how he cared for those who loved him, especially when the world seemed to have turned away. That night, closing an old photo album, Helen ran her hand across the cover and whispered, "Now we can create new memories. Maybe simple, maybe small, but true." Andrew nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He looked at her, not with the pride of vanity, but with the pride of a man who had finally understood. Her illness had taught him more than his success ever could. And with quiet certainty he knew, the greatest lesson of life was this: in sickness or in health, the value of love is eternal. This story reminds us that love and pride can change everything. If it touched you, subscribe now, and tell us in the comments what lesson you take from it.